Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, January 26th of 2021, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is January 31st of 2021. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B. And we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. We develop perspectives independently before the podcast, after the lead-off person shares some questions, and then we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sarah Mickelson.
Charles Willard. And I'm Don Upton. And Bill Hull is our lead-off today. Hello, my friend. What do you have in store for us?
Good morning, Don, Charles, Sarah, and welcome to those who join us later. A brief preparation for the reading of today's passage from the Gospel of Mark. Last week we read and reflected on the story in Mark 1:14-20 of Jesus' first call to disciples, Simon and Andrew, James and John. Jesus called them to follow him and to become fishers of men, fishers of people. During our discussion, it was stressed that fishing was a metaphor and image, not of literal, mechanical catching or reeling people in. Rather, the image communicates that relationships with people are central to Jesus' ministry, and further, that followers of Jesus will seek to connect with and influence other persons. And I stress that because I think it helps frame our passage for today, which is Mark, the following passage from last week, Mark 1:21-28. This is the word of the Lord. Let us listen. They, Jesus and those disciples, went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once, Jesus' fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, Charles, do you have something to share with us before we dive into the questions?
I'm making a comment based upon our earlier conversations. We meet for about a half an hour before this, and we've been reading this material for about a week before we sit down to discuss it. And based on that, I want to put in a word of, what should I call it? A word of caution that the text is what we have, and we need to be careful not to go too far beyond the text without recognizing that that's exactly what we're doing. We're going beyond the text, for which we have leave, but we need to be careful. And in this case, I simply want to remind us and the listeners and the readers afterwards who follow and take a look at the text, the man with the demon, the unclean spirit or spirits that goes back and forth, never speaks. Jesus speaks. The people who are observing what's happening, they speak to each other about Jesus and about what's happened. The demon speaks, But the man never says anything. And we have no idea what he felt, what he thought, what he experienced, or even what he did. It's a caution.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Just one minor clarification in case someone's confused. The man does, in fact, speak. I think, Charles, what you're saying is once he's healed, he doesn't speak because it is quoted that before he speaks. You're correct. After the healing, there's no record of what he said. And that's a helpful caution. And I'm going to take a minute or two to read some background material that strongly shaped where I'm going this morning. And for the sake of an economy of words, I'm going to read what I've written and what I've quoted from Mark Davis. In Mark, the very first event that follows Jesus' call to several disciples is a healing encounter between Jesus and a demon-possessed man. This healing for me is a powerful example of what Jesus meant by using the image of fishing. Remember I said that image is, in my mind, not a mechanical one. It's about the importance of relationships with people. And immediately Mark chooses to tell us this very challenging encounter between Jesus and a demon-possessed man. In this week's gospel passage, we read that there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." I would note for you a little point of grammar, and I'll highlight this in a moment with Mark Davis's quote. The him that Jesus rebukes is, I am convinced, the spirit and not the man. That's at the heart of what I'm about to read from Mark Davis. Mark Davis, in his interpretation of this passage, says this: I am really struck with the synthesis of identity and difference when it comes to this man who is in an unclean spirit. The man and the unclean spirit are identical in some ways. One would encounter both at the same time. It would be the man's mouth moving as the unclean spirit is talking, etc. And they are different in some ways, most clearly seen as the spirit comes out of the man. What I am calling a man and his cage is the synthesis of both the sameness between the two and the difference between the two. It seems to me that ignoring either the identity or the difference could be problematic. If we merely saw the unclean spirit as a different entity than the man, we would be ignoring the genuine tragedy of his life, the degree to which this unclean spirit has damaged his psyche, his body, his relationships, his ability to be productive or loving or happy. If we merely saw the sameness, we would be reducing his humanity to his situation. It seems to me that the full, and this to me is the key sentence, it seems to me that the full dimension of this man's tragic situation is being honored by the way Mark is describing him in this story. That the tragic dimensions, and yet the man is honored. Mark Davis's frame of identity and difference and honoring the person is what shapes my suggested questions for us. And heads up, Don, I'm coming to you first with this question. Given Jesus' response to this demon-possessed man, how might this inform our individual, congregation, and societal ways of addressing mental illnesses today? Don?
Thank you. I'll start by saying thank you for raising this and taking us in this direction. And I think I need to say that for the purposes of this day's discussion, I accept your approach in terms of looking at this and having discussions about mental illness and addiction. I accept that. And because I think we have lots of listeners coming from a lot of different places in terms of theology and the Bible, and I accept your direction. I also want to say that I think in the spirit of this, in the spirit of honoring the person I buy into that completely, that I think that's at the center of this story. In that spirit, I also know that I must stand down, that there are things I can listen for and help with and things I cannot, and that I have a personal, professional responsibility not to help in certain ways and to help in others. And I think, I know I'm interpreting in 21st century terms, but that's important to me to say that. To get it started, I was struggling with the first question, and I went back to my notes, and my notes had a sermon from 1/29 of the year 2012. And there is the associate pastor at Balmacea Presbyterian Church, a church, by the way, which allowed the four of us to meet and see each other, right, and honor each other. And Nicole, and I'm paraphrasing, Nicole Parton said, let's start here. Why don't we turn off the Hollywood special effects for a little while? This is an ordinary day, an ordinary Sabbath, and potentially I'll add to it maybe a circumstance that may be more ordinary than is written in our hearts and what's written in the Bible. It's ordinary in its insight, and I think that ordinariness helped me to sit down and understand how somebody like me, who is not a physician and not a social worker and not an expert of the field and not a clinical person at all, to deal with this. And I'll just say that where my thoughts went on this was in terms of discovery and love and honoring the individual. My job is to remember when professionals, clinicians, social workers have revealed to me or put their hand on my shoulder and said, you're not seeing the world. And I mean from science point of view, you're not seeing the world, Don. This is what this is. This has a diagnosis. This has a treatment. We have a way of looking at these things, and you are not competent to look at the world. And so I take that away as a final note on this first question, that it's a challenge to my own competency, that I want to see this other. I want to rush to conclusions. And as an American, a quiet American who does not engage where I should in public policy, we no longer have this as an ordinary occurrence, because in this country we have criminalized mental health, and the numbers of hundreds of thousands of people. They don't walk into church. They don't walk into our synagogues or temples on an ordinary day anymore. They are in prison. And so they're more out of sight than what we're seeing in this. So that's my starting point, Bill. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. Sarah.
I two things. I agree with Don first, and I have some cautionary anxiety about being wise enough to determine whether or not somebody has got a mental illness. So having said that, I think, though, that one of the things I can say is that I'm called to stay in a relationship. I'm called to continue to see that person, the whole person. I'm called to not shun them or to design them or erase them and make them invisible to those around me, but yet to acknowledge that I don't have the appropriate scaffolding and tool bag to approach wellness with them. I can only walk alongside and bear witness, and if you will, be an extra set of hands to assist. But I am not wise enough, and I am certainly not educated enough to diagnose, to tell somebody what they should do or should be doing. And I'm certainly invested in sustaining relationships. I want to be invested in seeing that person in the wellest opportunity and the wellest choices, if there's such a thing as wellest. So with those two kind of caveats, I want to be cognizant that fear can be the number one driver of a lot of human behavior. It can drive my behavior away from someone else when I'm afraid of them, and away from someone else when I don't know how to respond. And that being said, I want to stand in relationship to Christ and to those around me and say, I want to see you whole. I want to see you well. I want to see you living into the created person that you were designed to be, or you were crafted to be. And acknowledge that I have a big stick in my own eye that I need to pull out. That's my answer.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the words of caution, and I would echo them. I will in a moment. Again, for me, and I take to heart Charles's caution. I think it's spot on. But I think we have to take the risk of moving from the ancient text to how it speaks to us today. And Mark Davis offers the bridge of the identity difference, that concept that whether it's mental illness or whatever the difficulty is, I am not my addiction. I've had people with physical illness say, I don't want to be thought of as an invalid. I am not my whatever the condition is. And that ability to see the person and recognize the challenge that they face, that both-and approach I resonate with. I think, first of all, in my opinion, we all have struggles, whether we call it mental illness or whatever. And what the least we can do as people of faith is challenge the stigma that goes with, quote, mental illness. And Don, when you made that comment, I remember that there was a choice nationally at one point, basically, to do away with the institutions where we were housing people in the what proved to be false assumption that communities would rise to the occasion and provide the resources without the federal government funding that. And I live in St. Pete. You don't have to drive very far to see the outcome of that policy, but we're not here to debate that. But the stigma is very deep and powerful, so we can offer support and understanding and firmly encourage the person seeking professional help. One of the things I, with some frequency, dealt with as a pastor, someone would come to me and acknowledge obsessive compulsive behavior or whatever, and say, pray for me that like the man in this story in Mark, I'll be magically healed. Now, for me, that illustrates why we have to move beyond the literal story. The literal story, quite frankly, in my life, I have never seen happen. I have never observed someone instantly and magically be healed of what we might label a mental illness. Now, I also dealt with on visiting in worship and leading worship a disturbed person interrupting the worship service. I mean, getting up and basically stopping worship. And then, fortunately, in each case, there were people who caringly but firmly either helped the person settle down or gently guided them out. Both and. I think it's appropriate to seek to deal with that disruption, again, kindly and with as much wisdom as we can. And real briefly, an example that will illustrate my excitement about this. I am, and Sybil and I are involved with FAST here. It's analogous to HOPE, which Palmacia is a member of. It's a county-wide, interfaith, nonpartisan group of people. Currently, we have about 40 churches represented, and we are advocating for social justice. One of the issues we're dealing with is mental illness. Now, there's no magic in language, but we don't use the word mental illness. We call it behavioral health. That's a simple, but I think profound attempt to remove the stigma and to speak of it as a behavioral health issue. And again, I'm not going to get into the weeds, but very briefly, what we're dealing with is currently in Pinellas County, if you dial 211, the information line, you will be told there are 90 different places and agencies you can go to, but you're on your own to figure out which one is appropriate for your need. We are advocating for what's called a central pathway. There are existing vendors who do this. In other words, you call, a person engages with you and with some definition of your need helps you identify among all those resources where you might best go. And in some cases, availability. Maybe that facility has no room for someone. It humanizes and, for want of a better way to put it, makes the referral more efficient. We recommended this to the county commission, and the cost for this would be about $450,000. Instead, they hired an outside firm to do an evaluation, paid them $400,000, and their report ended up recommending they do what we suggested. And so far, the county commission has not funded the central pathway. If you hear some energy behind this, you're hearing me correctly. My point is that there are wiser, more caring ways we can address these behavioral issues. And I hope the church and people of faith can find their voices and at least explore more effective human ways of dealing with that challenge. Again, Don, you're right. This is a deep, broad subject. We can't resolve it, but we can say as people of faith that we're called to seek for creative ways of responding. And in fact, question 2 leads to that. Before I move on, Charles, anything you want to add?
No, thanks.
Okay. Number 2, in a similar vein, how might this scriptural narrative shape our ways of ministering to addicted people and not just those chemically addicted? And here, again, Charles, I will acknowledge I'm taking a leap here. I'm building a bridge that may be rickety. Maybe it won't hold. But I think another kind of possession is addiction. Now, when I was growing up in the 50s, I heard older people speak of demon rum. They spoke of alcohol addiction as a kind of demon. So that's one possible way to link this. There was an article referred to in Mark Davis's article, and I might say it's rather lengthy. I'm only going to briefly allude to it and pick up on a couple of highlights. If you want the link to the full article, which is well worth the reading, email us at Lectionary, call in at palmacia.org, and Don will repeat that before we end. The title of the article is "The Likely Cause of Addiction Has Been Discovered, and It Is Not What You Think." And it deals with the ideas we have and the convictions and prejudices we have about chemical addiction and other addictions. But he refers to experiments and data that challenge that and to say the real issue is the ability or inability of people to connect. And he offers some hopeful examples of programs, particularly highlighting Portugal, where they decriminalized drug addiction and drug use and took a more humane relationship-based approach, and there's data to suggest that that had great effectiveness. For me, it's an example of what I said in the first question. There are other ways to frame and to understand human challenges. And one of the stigmas of drug addiction is we lock people up in prison, which more isolates them from healthy relationships. And in the article, the writer gives some examples of how that just makes things worse. It doesn't lead to a new sense of wholeness. And again, I think there's a balance that we need to maintain. I was involved in supporting a lot of people in 12-step recovery programs. And I guarantee you, every meeting I went to, there were multiple examples of what we call tough love. Saying to the person, in effect, I will never stop loving you. All that's necessary for you to be in this group is you want to deal with your addiction. But brother or sister, you need to take responsibility for what you're doing. And it's a both and. We will support you, but you have your own choices to make. Offering, it seems to me, what this article on addiction is advocating, the human connectedness. Okay, let's see. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Well, I'd say in response to that question that it's important that we hold to the idea of loving each other, as difficult as that is. And we hold to the idea of standing in relationship with anyone and Christ. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we don't have the answers and that we are willing to help or to stand in attendance as someone seeks to find help. I think that we are called into relationship with people no matter how messy or dirty or disorganized or difficult they are, because we are Christ's followers. That being said, I looked at the scribes in this story and I thought about their particular role as being teachers in the community. And hearing a cautionary word about being only those that would preserve the law or preserve the word and not those that might proclaim the word. There's a hint of we get to that comfortable place where we believe we have all the answers and then we are not receptive to those that might bring something fresh and new to the conversation. And I worry against, those that are in relationship with anyone seeking care, that we have to be willing to let them be the drivers of the healing process and the seekers of the wellness. You can't, regardless of our desire to do this, we can no longer drag the horse to the water and force them to drink. For lack of better examples. But I think that, you oftentimes we are only observers and participants in the relationship and not necessarily the healer in the relationship.
Yes, Sarah. We are not the great physician. We are not the good shepherd. We are to point to that good shepherd. And I completely agree with you that, and this is where I would, if on another occasion we were to debate this article I referred to, I think it runs the risk of sounding a bit magical. If we just have healthy relationships, people will recover. I think later in the article he kind of steps back from that and acknowledges that ultimately we can lead the horse, maybe, but we can't force the horse to drink. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Don?
Thanks. I've got a personal philosophy about your neighbor. And you can agree or disagree with me on this, but I feel pretty strongly about it, that my neighbor is someone that I can see. There are other things I'm responsible for. There's other acts of love related to those I cannot see, especially in the 21st century. I can deal with issues of policy and democracy and investment and taxation, and I feel like I'm responsible for understanding that and investing there. And that helps people too. You can act with love there. But my belief is that a neighbor is a person in the line of sight, Good Samaritan. He sees the man on the side of the road. It's what comes into your view. And in this case, is someone coming into view. I'm just, because you raised what's happening with mental health in the United States and our prison system, I'll go with that and say, isn't it interesting that it's on an ordinary day we work to place this out of sight, and there's just such a stunning story in our own country about not just stigma, but the connection of this to paying a penalty. That we have really prisons are where much of the treatment, so-called treatment, is being done for those that have mental illness. And I'm interested in the movement to decriminalize mental health, and I think organizations like the Sozo Say Foundation. By the way, that means creativity. I heard creativity come on to start looking at decriminalization of mental health. And just to put it into context, there's Dr. Christine Montross' book, Waiting for an Echo, The Madness of American Incarceration. She says, it is a quote, no matter how a person has become imprisoned, everyone behind bars is treated the same. Correctional facilities in our country operate under the absolute, if erroneous belief that all who are incarcerated have done wrong, and that those who have done wrong deserve punishment. End of quote. And to paraphrase further, she talks about a journey that most of us are familiar with from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where, in her words, the mental health system, the care system, the state system was decimated. And these things were blended into prisons. 10 times more people with serious mental illness are incarcerated than in state hospitals today. Hundreds of thousands of people all blended together. So if you want to think about what is the role of the police, which has been in question, and how do we deal with what's happening in the field on any given day or night, these things are lumped together. When we think about where do you have access to care, these things are lumped together. And we've separated this from our concept of medicine and other kinds of treatment. I think there's an opportunity here. And I know, Charles, not only do we take the step towards mental illness in this, pulling that out of Mark, but now I'm pulling out into public policy. But Bill, you raised it, and I think there's an area here that it's since I cannot see my neighbor like Jesus could, because he walked right into the temple, like might happen on any ordinary day. Since those in need and certain stigmas are likely to be incarcerated, especially if they're a person of color, I might have a stronger obligation to be a little more aggressive about what creativity is needed to decriminalize mental health. And as the movement continues for universal access to health care, a human right of health care, does it occur to all of us that includes mental health, wellness? And I don't think it does. And those are the great preventative things that we can do. So even for the hard-hearted capitalists who measure this by dollars, which is a part of the mix because we want to deploy it, why not capture the entire concept so that we can move forward with a healthier nation, a healthier planet? Those are my thoughts, Bill.
Thank you, Don. Again, I would agree that this issue, along with any other issue, is multi-layered and nuanced. There are no simple solutions, but to refer to one of my favorite verses in Scripture, the last verse of 1 Corinthians 12, before the famous love chapter of chapter 13, I will show you yet a more excellent way. I think there are more excellent ways. Charles, before we move to my last question, do you have something to add?
Just a couple of comments. One, I want to read the last sentence in that article to which you've been referred. Actually, the last two sentences in that article to which you referred. It goes like this. I've left out one part, which is not really relevant to it, but for a century now, we have been singing war songs about addicts. It occurs to me we should have been singing love songs to them all along. And I think the emphasis upon the initiative taken by those in our position as opposed to the addict is important. And it's in that to begin with, at least, it's one way. We have to reach out. We have to find a way to do that. The other one, and this is just how do I want to put it, a wild pitch, I'll put it that way. Many years ago, when I was working in New Jersey, I became involved with a group, and at one point, we were talking about prisons, and we were talking about people who had been charged with crimes and for which they almost certainly were not guilty. And the leader said, Christians began by being responsible for schools and being responsible for hospitals. And now that hospitals and schools have been taken over by the government in one way or another, maybe we ought to think about the possibility of Christians taking over the prisons. I'll leave you with that.
Okay, thank you. All right. My third question, and Sarah, heads up, I'm going to you first. Are there ways you see yourself as like the man in this week's story? Are there within you conflicting and even warring dynamics, habits? How does the gospel of Jesus Christ offer you guidance and hope?
Well, I will say that my warring dynamics, habits, thoughts, and actions might lead me down a path of judgment and punitive punishment. That it's not fair. Whatever has happened, I think about those moments that my anger is invited into stories. I think that I often want to be judge and jury, and then the prison system to other people by demanding, if you will. And I'm going to use a Shylock phrase from the Shakespeare play. But I'm going to say, I want my pound of flesh. I want what's due to me. And I tend to have too much zeal, I think, when I'm overtaken by that anger or that desire for punitive punishment. And I think that's a human condition that we can all at least acknowledge, that we've met that particular experience before. And I think that one of the things that the gospel of Jesus Christ offers us is shifting that from punitive punishment into compassionate love. We've been the recipient of compassionate love and forgiveness, and that should in and of itself give us at least enough empathy that we can turn and look at each other with the same fresh eyes. Instead of weighing the law or the interpretation of it over someone's head and demanding that they are wrong, maybe our opportunity is to step back and consider that they might be right.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Don?
I'm thinking about what I hear from pulpits around the United States, and you'll know the prayer where there's the prayers of the people, and you hear the line, and there is no help in us. And I'll just say, at this stage in my life, at this moment, in this culture, I get off the hook. I may not be off the hook tomorrow. I don't take that good care of myself. I don't live a healthy life, not far from it. But I'm off the hook. I don't get stigmatized just because of where I'm coming from. And my issues, illnesses, phobias, whatever it might be, I'm off the hook. And in my ordinary life, I can stay off the hook. And I just wanted to hold that out. I think I was listening to, I attended a virtual summit just a few weeks ago. The Sozo Say Foundation did. And what kept coming back was the statement that, so shocking I wanted to run away from it, that most people believe that incarceration of any kind should inflict suffering. That may not be in your heart, it's not in mine, but most folks, my understanding, most statistics I read, want people to be punished and suffer for their crimes, not just loss of liberty. And that's a big part of our tradition, that you must suffer. And so we've lumped mental illness into a system where it's built to inflict suffering, from solitary confinement to exposure to disease to the lack of health care. And I think I'm saying that because it runs parallel to the power that someone who is healthy, whatever that means, the healthy society, I keep hearing, and there is no health in us, the power to imprison people who are made into the other. And this is the big one. This is a big one. The entire system, the commercial prison system, everything is built on this. I'm not raising all the, not coming up with answers, but I think there's something to be said about being aware of those things and thinking about how our actions can actually affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who do not have access to what is basically should be health care, that we've segregated as something different and criminalized. But I think that's important, and I'll just wrap up by reading one more quote from a book by Elisa Roth. It's called Insane, intentionally labeled that. She says, and I'm quoting, "Although historical records and statistics provide only an approximate view, it is clear that our jails and prisons have always served, to some extent, as clinics or hospitals for people with mental illness. From the earliest days of colonial America through the era of asylums in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and right up to the present, this was true even during the heyday of state hospitals in the mid-20th century, when it was estimated only about 1% of the total population with serious mental illness was incarcerated, and that about 5% of the total population of people with mental illness is now in jail or prison, can be attributed to the overall rise in incarceration. This speaks to the fact that overrepresentation of mental illness in the criminal justice system is partly a story of mass incarceration." These big numbers. I can't, in my philosophy of what is my neighbor, I cannot say they are my neighbor because I cannot see them. We have culturally and as a matter of policy separated them. And it is a deep tragedy, and I think it's an area where we can affect Christian love in an aggressive way. Final note, where it started was in our ordinary lives, and we, on any given day, there go I. Those that have experienced trauma and those who are suffering with what's a wide range of mental illness. First, I've learned as a professional attorney and a communications professional that I can't go there, and that's step one, and that I depend in the spirit of the gospel and those followers of the way who Jesus insisted on hanging out and talking with each other can put a hand on each other's shoulder and say, there's a better way, and you don't know. It kind of reminds me of some of the moments in the gospel where people come walking on the scene, like this one on an ordinary day. Who is that woman? Who does she think she is? Who are these people talking about us? We're busy. How dare they come here? And even there are moments when Jesus is saying he has to be drug into it. Not now. Why are you bothering me? I think it's, an exercise in faithful listening and knowing that I can't diagnose this. So this is a Christian rejection of mysticism, Christian rejection of mystical libertarianism. And that's where I go. And I just want to make it clear. I mean, we have listeners from all walks of life, all faiths. We have physicians listening to us, people engaged in mental health listening to us. I am saying, I don't know. I need help. I need to pray and think because I cannot see my neighbor like Jesus could at the time. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Don. I will use something you referred to as a bridge to my comments. I was in seminary, Columbia Seminary in the Atlanta area in the mid-1960s. Dr. Thomas McDill was a professor of pastoral care, and I still vividly remember early in that introductory course and throughout that course and other courses I took, he would on occasion stop and say, because this is the mid-60s, we were all full of vim and vigor and idealism, and we all thought in some way, well, I think the ones I hung out with, that we knew how to fix the world and we knew what needed to happen. And he would periodically, especially when one of us was waxing eloquent out of that grandiose spirit, he'd say, remember the words of the ancient prayer of confession, there is no help in us. Now, this is a professor who believed in hope, who believed people could be helped, who believed people could change. But an important dynamic for him was that concept, there is no health in us. And we don't like that. We want to argue about it. But I think there is wisdom in that. My response would be that I think there are demons within me and everybody. Or another way to say it, I think we all have our addictions. On those occasions, I preached 12-week series on the 12 steps. The title of the series was The 12 Steps for Everyone. To be very personal, what I became aware of was an addiction to people-pleasing. That's a socially acceptable addiction, especially for pastors, but it's limiting. And that, to me, is the issue here. It's not that or that it has to be some really bad behavior or pattern of behavior. It's that it interferes with your really being the person God calls you to be. And among other things, we are, as Christians, not just pastors, we are called to be prophets. And prophets are often not people pleasers. It's not a license to go out and be abrupt and rude, but it is about authenticity. And I think in a way, Sarah, I'm going to echo what I understood you to say. Something I've been more recently aware of is a kind of addiction to anger about what's going on in our nation. And what has helped me with this is other folk in our community that we talk with are saying the same thing. I'm tired of being angry. It's like I'm addicted to it. And that's one reason I like working with FAST, because it's a database. We do extensive research, and when we make a recommendation to elected officials, we provide them data. That doesn't mean they have to agree with us, but we're not just getting up spouting idealism. We're identifying real issues. I'm involved in the affordable housing issue. We have 70,000 people in Pinellas County who are dealing with inadequate or no housing. That's a real issue, and there are many ways to respond to it. So I haven't arrived, Sarah, but I'm at least acknowledging that there's an addictive quality to anger. And one way I've tried to deal with that addiction is watching very little TV news, reading selected articles in the New York Times online and so forth. But it's a very real challenge for me. Charles, any response to this question or overarching questions before we move to Don and closing out?
I'm fine to move to Don.
Okay. All right. Don, I've handed the ball off to you. You're about to help us win the Super Bowl. Go for it.
Thank you. Well,
you're the quarterback.
Oh, no and never. But have you seen me throw? So just this, I am every day as I spend more time on this subject, stunned how it's woven into our communities and the choices that we make about where we spend our money and where we don't. And you'd mentioned housing. Well, housing and homelessness are directly tied to this subject as well. And I'm not raising it to say it's hard. I'm raising it to say that we need to look at this with new eyes, with expert eyes, with clinical eyes, which I don't have. I have to, as a follower of the way, have someone put their arm around me and go, let's learn, let's go, let us go, let us see. And that's harder today than it was years ago. So thank you for the discussion, and thanks for everybody who's watching on Zoom or listening on our podcast. Palma Sia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you go there, especially during the time of pandemic, that would be now for this actual recording, there's other discussions of the Gospel Lectionary. Great sermons, reflections, prayers, outstanding music. So we commend that site to you as a destination for more thinking, conversation, and prayers. And we have our own email. So if you'd like to communicate with us, we're at Lectionary Call-In at palmacia.org, Lectionary Call-In at palmacia.org. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.